Hello and welcome. My name is Arturo Lopez-Levy. I am Assistant Professor of International Relations and Politics at Holy Names University in Auckland. I will be the moderator today of today's panel's Election 2020 Implications for US-Cuba Relations. The organizer of this seminar are the Cuba programs of the Institute of Latin American Studies of Columbia University and Nuestra America Initiative, a Facebook and YouTube program about American and Latin American politics that we host on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The webinar is also supported by Harvard University Cuba program, Holy Names University, the University of Miami, and Florida International University. The seminar is an academic effort to open up conversation about research and policy. The goal is to bring together ideas about US-Cuba relations and about Cuba as a topic of the 2020 American election. We hope to discuss the dynamics of American politics behind US policy towards Havana. For example, which were the political drivers of the policy shift from President Obama engagement as reflected in the presidential order of October 26, 2016 to President Trump's approach of reinforcing sanctions. It is relevant also to identify the main general topics, trends, and dynamics in American politics that might have implications for US-Cuba relations after the 2020 elections. We have the benefit of an outstanding panel of 3 professors from Columbia and American University. Each of them separately has decades studying Cuba and US-Cuba relations. Professor Margaret Crahan is a senior research scholar and director of the Cuba program at Columbia at the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. From 2007 to 2009, she was the Kosmetsky Distinguished Professor and Director of the Kosmetsky Center of Excellence in Finance at St. Edward's University in Texas. She was also, from 1982 to 1994, the Henry Luce Professor of Religion, Power, and Political Process at Occidental College, California, and the Dorothy Epstein Professor of the City University of New York from 1994 to 2008. Dr. Crahan has published over 100 articles and books about Cuba, including Cuba-US relation normalization and its challenges, and Donald Trump y las relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos en la encrucijada, together with Professor Soraya Castro, that has registered for our seminar. She received her doctorate from Columbia University. Professor William LeoGrande is a professor of government and a specialist in Latin American politics and US foreign policy towards Latin America, as well as Associate Vice Provost for Academic Affairs of American University. Professor LeoGrande has been a frequent advisor of government and private sector agencies about Latin America and Cuba. He has written 5 books, including Our Own Backyard, the United States and Central America. Most recently, he is co-author with Peter Kombluk of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiation Between Washington and Havana. Professor LeoGrande has been also a Council of Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow and a Pew Faculty Fellow in International Affairs. He has his doctorate from Syracuse University. Professor Phil Brenner is a professor at American University School of International Service and affiliate professor of history. He has published widely on US-Cuba relations, US-Latin American relations, contemporary US foreign policy, US congressional politics, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. His most recent book is Cuba Libre, a 500-year quest for independence, co-authored with Peter Heisner. He got his doctorate from Johns Hopkins University. Professor Brenner and Professor LeoGrande are the editors, together with Professor John Kirk, who is also an attendee to our webinar, of the recent published volume, just recently, March 2020, of Cuba at the Crossroads. We are having this conversation in the spirit of searching for understanding about the optimal and most constructive policies at the critical juncture of 2020, with the world affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Is there any opportunity of cooperation between Cuba and the United States in this arena? While we are conscious of the importance of the politics of the Cuban American community, probably a subject for an entire webinar itself, we want also to explore other stakeholders and their influence, from farmers to airlines and travel industry, to churches, to human rights organizations. Many players within American civil society played important roles in impacting Washington's policy towards Havana. Cuba is itself going through its own critical juncture. Please allow me to list some important development to look in the coming year for those interested in the island. Last year, the country approved a new constitution that includes, for the first time since 1959, terms and age limits for all the major senior positions in government and adding private property to the legitimate forms of ownership in the island. In 2021, the Cuban Communist Party, the only one that legally exists in the one-party system in the island, will have its 8th Congress, in which the first intergenerational transition at the top of the Cuban party state is anticipated. Thus, the debate about Cuba in the 2020 elections reflect a conscience among American elites about the challenges and opportunities of this critical juncture for US-Cuba relations and US national interest. Our 3 excellent panelists will discuss these and other important topics. To begin, Dr. Crahan will focus on elements of US-Cuba relations that could influence the 2020 election. Following Dr. Crahan, Professor Bill LeoGrande will discuss the role that Cuba has played in the US presidential election campaign, focusing principally in the 2020 dynamics. And finally, Dr. Brenner will discuss how potential changes in the House of Representatives and US Senate may affect US-Cuba relations. After the 3 panelists, we will have a great opportunity for a question and answer session with our audience, one that includes many first-rank scholars, diplomats, and well-educated professionals with important knowledge and insight about Cuba, American politics, and US policy towards Cuba. Up to this morning, we have confirmed more than 300 attendees who registered for the webinar. They are from all over the world: China, Finland, Cuba, Spain, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Norway, Canada, the UK, and of course, many states in the United States. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can post your comments with the hashtag USCuba 2020 as one word. I thank all of you for joining us and thank all the great institutions that are sponsoring this seminar. We begin with Professor Crahan.
Thank you, Arturo. I'm very honored to be here together with Bill LeoGrande and Phil Brenner, 2 of the outstanding Cuba experts that I have encountered over my long years working in and on Cuba. Since we have a limited amount of time, I'm going to touch briefly on a number of elements that are contributing to the context of the November 2020 elections in the US. Amongst these contextual elements are the long history of tension between Cuba and the United States, dating from 1959. However, on December 17, 2014, Raul Castro, Cuba's head of state, and Barack Obama, President of the United States, both appeared on Cuban TV to announce that they had agreed to undertake a process of normalization after, as I suggested, 50 years of estrangement. This announcement occurred during the course of a conference of experts from Cuba, the United States, Latin America, and elsewhere to discuss US-Cuban relations.
We are having problem to hear you. Why don't we do something? Why don't we go to Bill LeoGrande and then we try to solve the issue of your microphone. Bill, can we go ahead and you do your presentation and then we go back to make after?
Sure, that's fine with me.
Okay, let's do that.
So first, I want to thank all the universities that are sponsoring us today, and thank all of you who are attending. It's a really wonderful attendance at today's webinar. I think most people would be surprised at how often Cuba has played a role in US presidential elections. In 1960, John F. Kennedy beat up on Richard Nixon in their first televised debate, accusing Nixon of having lost Cuba because he was part, of course, he was vice president of the Eisenhower administration. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson broke off talks with Cuba that Kennedy had started for fear that Barry Goldwater, his Republican opponent, would call him soft on communism. In 1976, Henry Kissinger broke off talks with Cuba after the Cubans sent troops to Angola because Gerald Ford was afraid that Ronald Reagan would accuse him of being soft on communism, which Reagan was in the process of doing, attacking Kissinger's policy of détente. And then, of course, in 1980, we had the Mariel migration crisis, which happened right in the middle of the 1980 presidential campaign. Reagan quipped at the time, Carter couldn't get the Russians out of Cuba, and so he's getting the Cubans out. In 1992, President Clinton endorsed the Cuban Democracy Act during the campaign, trying to appeal to the newly powerful Cuban American electorate. In 2000, Elian Gonzalez, a small boy rescued in the Florida Straits and turned over to his Miami relatives, was sent back to Cuba to his father by the Clinton administration, and that cost Al Gore the presidency. Cuban Americans cast a voto castigo because of the return of Elian. And of course, in 2016, Donald Trump tried to appeal to Cuban Americans by promising to reverse Obama's policy of engagement. So two issues really emerge as important in these presidential campaigns. For the first few decades after 1959, Cuba was a national security issue. Candidates, especially Democrats, were afraid of looking soft on communism. But in the period after the Cold War, the focus has really been more on candidates wanting to win Cuban American votes. Cuban Americans, of course, are concentrated in two states, in New Jersey and Florida, but only about 100,000 Cuban Americans live in New Jersey. That's a state where Democratic presidential candidates typically win by, on average, about 500,000 votes. So the Cuban electorate in New Jersey is not central to presidential elections in that state. But Florida is always a battleground in presidential elections. Cuban Americans are 7% of the electorate there, 1.2 million eligible voters. And just to put that in context, Hillary Clinton lost Florida by just 113,000 votes. Cuban Americans are also the only constituency in the American electorate that cares enough about Cuba so that Cuba policy will determine how they vote. They're the only Latino group that is more Republican in their registration than Democrats, although the Republican margin has been eroding in recent years. And historically, most Cuban Americans have favored a tough policy towards Cuba, although that's changing as well. So Democratic candidates before Barack Obama saw the Cuba issue as dangerous, an issue to be avoided. If you weren't tough on Cuba, you would lose Cuban American votes in Florida, and you might, as a result, lose the state. But you wouldn't gain anything by having a policy of engagement towards Cuba because no other constituency was voting based on that issue. The dilemma that Democrats faced, however, was that they could never be tougher on Cuba than Republicans. But in 2008, Barack Obama tried a new strategy. He tried appealing to moderates in the Cuban American community, a growing group of Cuban Americans, those born in the United States on the one hand, and those who had come to the United States more recently, particularly after 1990. Florida International University has been polling Cuban Americans since 1991. And they've shown that those two groups, the late arrivals and naturally born citizen Cuban Americans, have more moderate views. So those who came more recently came primarily for economic reasons. They've stayed in touch with their families. They travel back and forth to Cuba. They send remittances. And for them, a better relationship between the two governments is a positive thing because it makes it easier for them to sustain family ties. Obama's strategy of appealing to this moderate wing of the community worked. In 2008, he won 35% of the Cuban American vote, more than any Democrat other than Bill Clinton in his second election. And in 2012, Obama won 48% of the Cuban American vote, more than any Democrat had ever won. And finally, half of Cuban Americans supported Obama's policy of normalization when he announced it in 2014. So it looked like the Cuban American community in Florida was shifting enough so that Florida was no longer the third rail of presidential politics for Democrats. But then in 2016, Donald Trump won a majority of Cuban Americans again by promising to reverse Obama's policy and to increase sanctions against the island. Trump is convinced that he won Florida because of the Cuban American vote, and Senator Marco Rubio has worked hard to convince the president of that. And the president, has delivered on his promise to roll back just about every element of Obama's policy of normalization. President Trump's appeal is a visceral one. He appeals to the emotional dislike that Cuban Americans have toward the Cuban regime in the same way that he appeals to the grievances of all of his base constituencies. So I think when it comes to the 2020 election, we can assume that we're going to see more of the same from the president. He'll emphasize his tough policy, pointing out that he's delivered on his promise, and he will likely add additional sanctions as the election approaches. We've seen that consistently since early 2019. Every few months, there's a new sanction rolled out, and often it's announced in a speech given in Miami by some administration official. The other thing the president is doing right now is linking the issues of Cuba and Venezuela, bringing together these two anti-communist constituencies in the diaspora. And that's been effective. It's re-energized the Cuban American right as well as mobilizing Venezuelan exiles. The president has pursued very aggressive attacks on Vice President Biden in the Florida media, and those attacks have already begun. And his strategy there is to link the vice president to Bernie Sanders, to socialism, and to Obama's appeasement of Cuba. And the idea here is to try to erase in the mind, particularly of Cuban Americans, erase any distinction between a progressive democratic agenda and Cuban Venezuelan style socialism. Biden's strategy on the Cuba issue has been, thus far at least, one of caution and I would say avoidance. Now, the vice president supports President Obama's policy of engagement. He supported it at the time, and he has reiterated that support during the campaign. But he has not been pursuing President Obama's strategy of proactive engagement with a policy of trying to appeal to the moderate wing of the Cuban American community, the way President Obama did. Instead, the campaign has really focused on national issues like healthcare and the economy. That's an old strategy that Democratic candidates faced. Try to stay away from the issue of Cuba, but focus on economic and social issues on which Cuban Americans have views not so different from the views of other Latinos. I think this may be a missed opportunity for the vice president's campaign because Cuban Americans have really been collateral damage of the President Trump's sanctions regime. So he has limited remittances that Cuban Americans can send to family members. He ended the Cuban family reunification program, which enabled Cubans on the island with family in the United States to move up in the line for immigration to the United States. He cut off most air service to Cuba to every city except Havana, which makes it harder for Cuban Americans to visit their families outside of the capital, and makes it harder for Cubans living outside the capital to come visit families in the United States. And finally, he ended the 5-year multiple entry visa for family travel. That enabled Cubans to come to the United States to visit family members any number of times over the course of their 5-year visa. Well, the Trump administration did away with that. Now Cubans who want to come visit family in the United States every time have to travel to a third country in order to be interviewed for a visa. Now, having said that I think that the vice president's campaign is missing an opportunity to appeal to a moderate sector of the Cuban American community. The polling out of Florida, at least to date, shows the vice president with a significant lead. Just last week, a Florida Atlantic University poll was released that showed Vice President Biden leading Trump by a margin of 53 to 47, and by an even wider margin among independents. Among Latinos, not just Cuban Americans, but all Latinos in Florida, the vice president was leading 51 to 33. Although 16% of Latinos were still undecided, which should be a red flag, I think, for the Biden campaign. So what should we expect in the next couple of months? Well, Cuba is not going to be a national issue unless there's some unanticipated crisis. So the debate over Cuba policy is going to be confined to South Florida local media. Trump will harp on how tough he's been and reiterate his promise of regime change and try to paint Biden as Obama's partner in appeasement. Biden will try to say as little as possible about Cuba, counterpunching on the Cuba issue only when he has to. And Trump will probably win a majority of Cuban American votes again. But whether Cuban Americans make the difference in Florida and in the election will depend on how successful Democrats are in winning suburban independents and turning out their core constituencies, especially African Americans and non-Cuban Latinos. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Let's see if Meg is able to come back and do her presentation. Are you ready, Meg? You have to unmute the, yeah? Hello? I cannot hear you well, Meg. Could you speak a little louder? I cannot hear you. So let's.
Hi, Meg. You know, one thing that I would recommend is either logging in and then logging off and logging back in to see if that works. And then I also sent you a message in the chat for you to call in to the webinar. So if you could look at that, maybe something you can do, Arturo, is go on to the next panelist.
Hey, Jill, could you send me the link again?
Sure, will do.
Okay. Okay, Phil, are you ready then? And let's do your presentation first, and then we go back to Meg. Okay?
Thank you very much, Arturo. I also would like to thank the sponsors of this webinar, especially you and the technical staff of Holy Names University and Professor Margaret Crahan and the Cuba Studies program at Columbia. In the next 15 minutes, what I'd like to focus on is the way potential changes in the US House and Senate may affect US-Cuban relations in 2021. For a long time, people have ignored Congress, probably for good reason, and this Congress is pretty much broken. But that doesn't mean that Congress is irrelevant to US-Cuba policy, and I want to indicate the ways in which that is likely to happen. Let's start with some just raw numbers. And the House and Senate elections. The House is likely to remain Democratic, with perhaps 10 to 15 more Democratic seats. This will mean there won't be very much change in the leadership of the key committees that would affect US-Cuban relations. Eliot Engel will be the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Alberto Series, the congressman from Cuban-American Jersey City, will continue to chair the Western Hemispheric Affairs Subcommittee. The Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, which turns out to be probably the most critical unit in the House of Representatives for dealing with Cuba policy, will continue to be chaired by Nita Lowey, who is a progressive Democrat, and the number 2 person on that committee, Barbara Lee, will continue to play a very important role. The Agricultural Subcommittee on Livestock and Foreign Agriculture, the chair is Jim Costa from Fresno, California. His concerns have to do much more with farming in California than anything else, and so he'll have very little interest about Cuba. And financial services, which used to be called banking. The chair of that committee is Maxine Waters, a very powerful and able legislator. If banking issues take the fore, and they well might, because Cuba may be back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, then she'll play an important role. The chair of the subcommittee on national security and international development, Emmanuel Cleaver, who's from Kansas City, Missouri, is not much interested in actually international affairs. Let's take a look at the Senate. If the Republicans retain control, there will be very little change. James Risch would likely continue as chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Marco Rubio, the senator from South Florida, is the number 2 person on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's just been named the acting chair of the Intelligence Committee. Rubio also chairs the Western Hemisphere Affairs Subcommittee. This is an illustrious subcommittee with members like Ted Cruz and Cory Gardner. So if the Republicans retain control, Rubio will likely be a major thorn, regardless of who is president. Although if there's a Democratic president, he'll have less opportunity to initiate policy. He will still have power to stop legislation. On the Appropriations Subcommittee on Foreign Operations, there would be little change if the Republicans contain control. But I think it is less likely that the Republicans will retain control if you look at the electoral map. The current polls reported by the website 538.com, this is Nate Silver's website, indicate that it's a real possibility that the Democrats will gain control of the Senate. The Democrats have only 1 seat that the polls consider slightly leaning Republican. That's Doug Jones in Alabama. Meanwhile, Republicans have 4 seats that are rated as toss-ups, and in fact, even leaning towards the Democratic side, and 5 seats that are only leaning Republican. So there could be a major shift, a Democratic gain of even 6 or 7 seats in the Senate. And of course, if a president wins, the vice president of the Senate would break a tie, and that would be a Democrat. So if there is a Democratic control, let's take a look at the changes that would take place on Senate committees. On foreign relations, Robert Menendez is likely to be the chair. Ben Cardin, who is a liberal Democrat from Maryland, is likely to be the Western Hemispheric Affairs Subcommittee Chair. Cory Gardner and David Perdue would likely be off the committee, probably because Cory Gardner will lose this election. Perdue may, but in any case, there would be more Democrats, and they would lose their position on the committee. So loss of two conservatives, but with Robert Menendez as the chair, that's a serious obstacle to major changes. The Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, the likely chairs will be Patrick Leahy, and who was very important in helping to restore diplomatic relations. And he'll be replacing Lindsey Graham, who is currently the chair of the subcommittee. Richard Shelby, conservative from Alabama, who chairs the full committee now, has been ex officio on the subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs, and he's likely to not take on that role as ranking member. Leahy, of course, is the number 2 person on the Judiciary Committee right now, but the chair is likely to become Dianne Feinstein. And so he'll, I think, will spend his time on appropriations. The Agricultural Subcommittee on Commodities, Risk Management, and Trade. Now, there's a subcommittee you might not ordinarily think about, but in fact has the potential to deal with trade with Cuba. Sherrod Brown, a liberal from Ohio, likely replace John Boozman, Republican from Arkansas. And the rest of the Democrats on that subcommittee are quite liberal. Finally, banking. The Subcommittee on National Security and International Trade was the subcommittee to which the Amy Klobuchar's Freedom to Export to Cuba Act of 2019 was submitted. And that subcommittee is likely to be chaired by Sherrod Brown is likely to be the chair of the full committee, and ex officio on that subcommittee, Mark Warner from Virginia would replace Ben Sass as the subcommittee chair. So those are places where there are possibilities. What would be the consequence of all this? Well, one consequence is that some Senate and House committees may be amenable to new legislation. But without 60 votes in the Senate, Republicans could still block significant change with a filibuster. That's assuming all the Republicans vote alike, which one needn't assume. There are Republicans who have interests in serving their constituents with trade to Cuba. So without President Trump there could be Republican votes to override a filibuster. Where would that filibuster come from? Well, it could come from someone like Rubio, but it might also come from Menendez. In 2009, he showed his tenacity in blocking President Obama's major economic program. This was during our last crisis, and Obama had proposed a $400 billion economic plan that Menendez filibustered, prevented from being enacted for a few weeks because he wanted a promise from the administration that they would not relax the standards by which produce could be sold to Cuba. And he demanded that there still be payment in advance and no credit established. So he is a tenacious anti-Cuban advocate. So let me turn quickly to what the congressional agenda might look like then. There are some goals that members of Congress who want to take an active role should keep in mind. One of those would be to advance U.S. interests, not to treat this as a gift to Cuba, which it would not be. Changes. The U.S. interests are significantly involved in relations with Cuba. For one, better relations with Cuba would help secure U.S. borders. When there's cooperation across the Florida Straits, Cuba makes possible 700 miles of southern U.S. border where there's no threat, no terrorism, no drug flights, no human trafficking, and an orderly migration. Better relations with Cuba would enable there to be biomedical research promoted that could combat diseases. Cuba, for example, has a drug that is now not available to Americans to prevent amputations for those who have diabetes. 60,000 Americans every year have some limb amputated because of diabetes, and Cuba has a well-tested drug that can prevent that. And a third U.S. interest is that the United States should not be in the business of discouraging openness and in any country or freedom. When the United States presents itself as a threat to Cuba, which it has under the Trump administration, with a variety of subversive activities, with clearly intended efforts to have regime change, the response in Cuba is to crack down on dissent. By having openness, you have more political space for people to engage constructively and build that society. Any regime that feels endangered will tend to circle the wagons. We did so after 9/11, and Cuba is under a potential threat from the world's most powerful country. So freedom is, when endangered by the United States, is likely to be suppressed. A second general goal would be to do no harm to innocents. President Trump's policy is premised on the belief that if Cubans suffer, they'll overthrow their government. This was the same strategy that failed for more than 50 years. Sanctions have not denied, I would note, President Miguel Diaz-Canel one meal, but they do harm ordinary Cubans. U.S. threats to retaliate against foreign companies under the Helms-Burton Act make it harder for Cuba to obtain, for example, inputs to the production of life-saving drugs. And Cubans, in fact, are suffering right now by their inability to be able to import drugs that they need. In short, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just quickly point out that under the Obama administration, there were 23 memoranda of understanding, agreements between Cuba and the United States. These were all executive agreements. They didn't have legislative backing, which would have enabled President Trump to reverse all of them. The good news is he reversed only one, and he left in place the other 22. But the bad news is that of those 22, only 7 are being fully implemented. And the next Democratic president could, in fact, reverse that by trying to implement those agreements. Where Congress' role then becomes important is trying to prevent the people who would want to stop that effort to renew relations between Cuba and the United States, to stop those legislators from pursuing their goals. And so a Congress, in the first instance, can act as a facilitator to the president. It also can initiate some things that might provide a basis for improved relations, and that might serve U.S. constituents, for example, opening up the possibility for negotiating claims between Cuba and the United States, that Cuba has indicated a willingness to have negotiations on. I think the first issue, though, is the opening of the embassy to have it fully functioning. And that's been held up, as you probably know, because of claims of tax on the health of the embassy personnel. And there's all of the existing evidence, and we can discuss this, is that there were no such attacks. That over the long period of time that this occurred, epidemiologists suggest that there's no reason to think that all of these different manifestations of problems could be attributed to one single source. And so it makes sense to open up the embassy if there are no longer, and there haven't been any new incidents in the last 18 months, there are no longer any incidents, to open up the embassy to fully function, and to have the Congress not pass legislation that would stop that, and or even to pass legislation encouraging that. In short, the November elections do matter, not as much as the presidential election, but the November congressional elections will be a way in which the Congress can now act as a facilitator rather than a hindrance to improve US-Cuban relations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Phil and Bill. We are waiting for Meg to connect. So I will pass some of the questions that I have seen in the chat. One of the questions that has been posted is what are the choices for the executive branch? Let's say if I think that the person that the people that are asking this question are assuming a democratic victory, is what are the options for the executive branch to improve relations with Cuba if the scenario that Professor Brenner presented, that there is a lot of chances for filibusterism in the potential legislation about Cuba. To feel that there are some people that are asking about what type of specific legislation can be presented immediately after if there is a democratic victory. And some people ask Sarah Sarah Cooker asked Bill about which new sanctions. You anticipated that new sanctions can be coming before the November election. And she asked what type of sanctions do you think that could come? And if we can think about a return to the travel policy of the Bush administration.
So let me start out. The Trump administration has already signaled that they intend to, or they may, put Cuba back on the terrorism list. Just a week or so ago, they certified that Cuba was non-cooperative with U.S. counterterrorism efforts, which is sort of first step towards the possibility of putting Cuba back on the terrorism list. So I think that's the most likely one. Frankly, the travel regulations are already as bad as they were under George Bush. The only area of travel that hasn't really been significantly constrained is family travel. So that's because the administration doesn't want to offend its Cuban American constituency. In terms of what a president could do, a Democratic president could do, I think Phil has really given you a great summary of the obstacles on the legislative side. And the implication of that is that a new Democratic president, President Biden, would face the same kind of constraints that President Obama did and would have to use his executive authority to return to a policy of engagement. Now, President Obama laid out a roadmap of what that looks like and went a good ways down that road already. So it would be relatively simple to restore what Obama had done and then take some new initiatives to continue down the road of engagement. Phil?
Oh, I agree with Professor LeoGrande. Sarah Coker asked about some specific legislative remedies. Well, one remedy would, if President Trump puts Cuba on the list of terrorist states, one remedy would be to have Congress remove it. Congress could also change the regulations on travel. I think there would be support fairly generally in Congress to do that, and it wouldn't go through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It could go through, for example, the Appropriations Committees. The question is whether or not Menendez or Rubio would feel compelled to have a filibuster on that, and since it's probably would be popular, I don't see that they would in fact do that. What's changed with respect to travel since President Obama is that there were 12 categories listed as a result of a 2000 law, and of people who could automatically have licenses to travel. Because we have an embargo, you need a Treasury Department license in order to travel. That's different than the visa coming from Cuba. And one of those categories was educational travel. And most people who went to Cuba, and there were hundreds of thousands of Americans who did, went under that category of educational travel. The cruise ships that have now been denied going essentially provided educational travel for the people getting off and spending a day touring around Havana. And so that is something that Congress could legislate and could, freedom to travel seems to be a popular issue. Cruise ships would be very much in favor of this. So I could see that some legislation in that area. These are in some sense peripheral, but they would be an important benefit to Cuba. I think that though it's, as Professor LeoGrande well said, it's the best route would be to start with the 23 memoranda of understanding and see how those could be fulfilled. There was a commission, a US-Cuban commission created to facilitate high-level discussions. A simple change could be to reinstate that commission and begin having negotiations.
Thank you very much, Professor LeoGrande and Professor Brenner. Let's see if we can solve the issue with Meg by audio. Nobel, can we connect Meg Crahan?
Yes, Arturo, can you hear me?
Yes, now we hear you perfectly.
I guess it's time to go back to regular telephones. And I regret the problems. I have no problem at the outset of the meeting, but then for some reason there was some sort of glitch that crept in. And thank the people at Holy Name for connecting me here. I would like to talk a bit, and Phil and Bill have covered so much already, that there are a couple things that I would like to comment on, which haven't been mentioned yet. And that is, what are the respective strategies, campaign strategies of Biden and Trump, given the limitations that the pandemic has imposed on normal type campaigning? It's very interesting to look at what is going on in terms of the adapted campaigns. It's interesting to note the degree to which the Trump campaign and Trump himself have, beginning about 3 weeks ago, mobilized very strong attack ads, both on TV as well as on social media. Beginning late April and intensifying in early May, you have a strategy used by Trump and his campaign that was similar to the one that they rolled out in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, which emphasized personal attacks and allegations that she was in poor mental and physical health, as well as being deficient ethically, etc. Increasingly, Trump and his campaign have made the same charges against Biden, mentioning his geriatric mental capacity and things of that nature. They have also attacked Biden's integrity and competence. And because Biden has repeatedly cited his participation in the Obama administration accomplishments, including the success of the economic stimulus initiated in 2009 to deal with the 2008 recession, they have increasingly also attacked Obama. And the attacks are also both not only in terms of accomplishments during the Obama administration, but also very personal attacks on Obama, so that the campaign has increased in the last month in terms of very negative attacks, and also the raising of a Obama gate, that is an attempt on the part of Obama personally to undercut Trump during the 2016 campaign. In the aftermath of the 2016 election, the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Opinion at Harvard University concluded, and I quote, "If everything and everyone is portrayed negatively, there's a leveling effect that opens the door to charlatans. The press historically has helped citizens recognize the difference between the earnest, honest politician and the pretender. Today's news coverage blurs the distinction." The center further concluded that negative and false campaigning had contributed to increasingly hostile partisanship in Congress and in the general public, thereby creating an unstable context for any election. That being the case, the possibility that you would have increasingly aggressive attacks, primarily lodged against Biden by the Trump campaign, is very likely. It's also possible that the intensified efforts to bar people from voting using the courts may also be heightened. So that what I'd like to suggest is that this campaign is already abnormal, but it's likely, particularly in the summer months and in the early fall, to become a much more aggressive, vituperative, and falsifying allegations, etc. And the impact of that is unclear, but I don't think it's going to be positive. Arturo?
Thank you, Meg. Thank you for this presentation. I think that the content, we were able to get the content of your presentation, and thank for the technical group that is helping us. There are several questions that I would like to add to the conversation. I'm simply trying to put together some of the questions that we have here. Although I think that Professor LeoGrande presented some ideas about it, there is a very interesting question by Teresa Garcia Castro that said, if you were advisor for the Biden and for the Trump campaign, what would your strategy for engagement with the Cuban American community be? Walk us through the two different scenarios. I want to add my own twist to this. I would like to question if there any way that Cuba can come to the discussion in foreign policy in the current elections associated to the relationship of the United States with other great powers. I noticed that many of the academic literature and the policy-oriented literature is looking at the relationship of between great powers and the rise of China, the competition with China, the Russia role in Latin America. Is there any way that this could bring some attention to Cuba that is not easy to motivate on the election? And there is another question that perhaps make or Phil or Bill can answer by Harold Cardenas. He is asking about the regime change programs. And he's asking if there is any possibility that in the case of a democratic victory, there will be a questioning of the efficiency or the legitimacy of these programs. So let's begin by this one. There are other interesting questions, and I will be posing them with the webinar.
Well, let me start out saying on the great powers issue, I think it's an issue that actually cuts both ways. Critics of the Trump policy have been arguing that by the United States withdrawing from engagement with Cuba, we create a power vacuum and we make it easier for Russia, China, Iran, other countries that the United States sees as adversaries to establish better relationship with Cuba. And so the United States misses out. But on the Republican side, the counter argument is, look at what an evil regime Cuba is. It's befriending all of these adversaries of the United States. We can't possibly engage with an enemy Cuban regime. So it's a tricky argument. In terms of giving policy advice, so I should say I don't speak for anybody but myself. But on the Trump side, I think the Trump administration strategy, or the Trump campaign strategy, from the last time around worked by, as Professor Crahan said, attacking personally the Democratic candidate, which we're already seeing now in Florida, as she said, and by appealing to the emotions of the Cuban American community and their animosity toward the Castro regime. Trump was able to increase the Republican share of the Cuban American vote by 4 or 5%. And so he's going to keep doing that. And it's hard for me, frankly, to put myself in the shoes of a Trump advisor. I guess I'd have to advise him to keep doing what he was doing because it worked. Now, on the Biden side, I think you've got something of a dilemma for the campaign, and it's the one I laid out in my remarks. They haven't been proactively going after the moderate segment of the Cuban American community because the judgment seems to be that raising the Cuba issue can hurt you among Cuban Americans, and it's not going to help you with other constituencies. And so therefore, it's better to just avoid the issue of Cuba. I would argue in favor of Obama's strategy of actually trying to appeal to the Cuban American community, because if you look historically at the Democratic share of the Cuban American vote, Obama was more successful than any other Democratic candidate. So his strategy seemed to be successful. So I would encourage the Biden campaign to go back to it, even though opinion in the community does seem to have shifted some. And that's another issue. The polling data does show a slight move in a more conservative direction among Cuban Americans. The social media atmosphere is very, very conservative and very Republican. I would just remind everybody that the social media blogosphere and Twitter account and Facebook, they do not represent, they're not a representative sample of either Democrats or Republicans. And so although they can sometimes set the tone of the conversation, they don't represent necessarily the views of most voters.
If I could add something to this, about Florida is a very important state. And I think that part of the concern is what happened in 2018 with the Republicans winning both the Senate and the gubernatorial race. But I think that had a lot to do with Rick Scott, who had been the governor. And he reached out to the Puerto Rican community and in fact made several trips to Puerto Rico after the horrendous hurricanes and provided aid to the Puerto Rican community. And that endeared him. Puerto Ricans voted for the Republicans in ways they hadn't before. That will not be the same with President Trump. There is revulsion about the way he treated Puerto Rico, throwing them a paper towel to clean up the hurricane mess. And I think the Puerto Rican community, so-called I-4 corridor, is going to play as important a role as the Cuban community. And so I'm not sure that Biden saying much about Cuba will be that beneficial, because I do think the Cuban community has changed some. And I think the Puerto Rican community will see it as the Cubans getting some attention that they always get, and people forget about us. So if anything, I would recommend that Biden focus on the Puerto Rican community in Florida rather than the Cuban American community.
I came across one recent poll of Puerto Ricans voting preferences, etc. That was done recently, and it was quite remarkable. Only 12% claimed that they would vote for Trump. The remainder of the Puerto Ricans who indicated that they would probably vote in November stated that they would vote for Biden. So there's a tremendous margin for Biden. And this was done in Florida, but there's also been some polls in Arizona that suggested that the preference of Puerto Ricans resident in Arizona who are planning on voting is also for Biden.
Of course, the one thing we've been focusing, because we're by and large focused on issues, we've been focusing on things like issues. I think the real effect of this election will be voter suppression. And in that case, the Republicans control Florida, the state machinery. And I think there will be, one of the ways in which Trump already has shown he hopes to win is by voter suppression. There will be massive voter suppression in Florida, particularly among the Puerto Ricans. So we have to be careful about that. That will be true in North Carolina as well.
What I haven't
Go ahead.
what I haven't seen are any polls, recent polls for Mexican Americans resident in California, because obviously that's going to be a state that will weigh heavily in the November elections. Has anybody seen any polls relating to Mexican American voters in California?
Well, actually, Meg, it's more important Mexican American and Latino voters in places like Arizona and Nevada. If a Democrat can't carry California, they're sunk anyway. But some of those swing states out there that have increasingly large Latino populations, those are going to be important.
Right.
And also,
But
yeah, go ahead, Meg.
No, I'm just curious about California because I haven't seen any polls. Maybe they're not doing any polls.
Okay, well, we have a group of questions that are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Some people ask about chances of testing the interferon alpha 2b, the Cuban medical product interferon alpha 2b, if there will be a political impact of testing this in the United States. There are ideas about or questions about suspending sanctions or stopping sanctions for the pandemic. There is an international pressure for that. If this could have an impact on a Democratic administration or in the Trump administration. There are questions also about the use of licenses and the communication by the Treasury Department OFAC that this will be the course that people trying to flexibilize or to make more flexible the use of or the export of medical products or humanitarian products to Cuba should follow. There is also a question about Venezuela. What role do you see Venezuela playing in the discussion about Cuba in the 2020 election?
Well, I can start on the issue of suspending the embargo. That's clearly not going to happen under the Trump administration. They've said as much. OFAC released a statement saying, "Hey, we don't have any regulations that prevent the export of humanitarian assistance or medical assistance, and the Cuban complaints that the embargo is inhibiting that are just propaganda." Well, that's really not entirely true. It is a requirement that an exporter who wants to send, say, medical supplies from China to Cuba using a U.S. carrier, the U.S. carrier has to have a license, and it's not a general license. They have to apply for a specific license, and that was what happened with the donations to Cuba from the founder of Alibaba in China. That's why that shipment was held up. It is the case that medical equipment can be sent to Cuba without a license because there is a statute that allows for the export of medical supplies and equipment to Cuba. One of the problems, of course, is still that US suppliers are just very reluctant to deal with Cuba because the sanctions regulations are so complicated. And so they're terrified of running afoul of the regulations, even when they could, in fact, proceed with certain business opportunities without having to go through OFAC.
One of those requirements is that none of the medical equipment be used by the Cuban military or the Cuban government, or on behalf of people in the Cuban government. And so that makes it very difficult when you have a state-run health system. That's one of the reasons medical supply people are leery. With respect to Venezuela, Cuba has made a principled statement that they would be willing to assist in any negotiations as long as Venezuela agreed to them. And so it's unlikely that Venezuela would come up as something that could be used unless there was a sense that we were treating Venezuela as a legitimate government and Cuba as a legitimate government. I don't see that happening in this administration, but Democrats could make the case that the Venezuela issue could be resolved with Cuban help if the United States changed its attitude towards Venezuela.
You have to have a US government that actually is really interested in a solution in Venezuela. I frankly don't think the Trump administration wants to see a negotiated settlement of the conflict there because they're using it in Florida as a baseball bat to hit Democrats over the head.
Meg?
Yes. I think we have to take into account the fact that there may be considerable amount of Venezuelan money, opposition money to the Maduro government that will be flowing in to Republican coffers in the final months of the campaign. There are strong rumors that money is being collected for that purpose in substantial amounts. And given the increase of Venezuelans currently resident in Florida, I think it's something that we should perhaps keep our eyes on to see if it. Go ahead.
I was going to say that would be illegal, of course. So perhaps Attorney General Barr will keep his eye on that.
Definitely. Controlling illegal contributions from foreign sources, I don't think is a priority for the current administration.
So let me add a couple of issues or questions to motivate your answers. I remember that in a major book about US-Cuba relations is called Back Channel to Cuba. Something that is reiterated is the idea that the United States has made a mistake anytime they has put the Cuban Revolution on the choice between either an alliance with the Soviets, basically with an alternative great power, or destruction. we need to take into account that we are entering into a period in which the post-COVID-19 situation will be particularly economically tough to Cuba. It's just a comment to what Professor Bill LeoGrande said about how the issue goes both ways. On the other hand, I think that in the relationship with Europe, it is important to mention that it seems that the situation is not like 1996 after the Helms-Burton law. The High Commissioner for Foreign Policy and Defense, Pepe Borrell, he has a long background of opposition and active reference to the extraterritorial and the negative implications for relationship between US and its allies of the implementation of Chapter 3 of the Helms-Burton. That is something that go beyond the understanding of 1998 between the European Union and the US. Will that has any impact? Is there any way that this could have any impact? And there is something that is coming. Iberostar had asked the European Commission about the requirement of providing information to the US court that brought Iberostar to court because of the application of Article 3. Is there anything here that can make President Trump, let's say in a second term or before the election, to rethink his ideas? There is another question here that said about if Trump is reelected, do you see a chance that the president reverse his policy towards Cuba and that his business first might gain his ideology?
No, I think is the answer to that. You know, if anything, one could argue that U.S. sanctions against Cuba under the Trump administration prevent any of the Trump organization's competitors from getting into Cuba, while the president is constrained by the fact that he's the president and therefore can't get in there himself. With regard to Europe, you know, there's no question that Europeans remain angry about the application of Title III. A lot of them have blocking, the EU itself has a blocking statute that allows companies that suffer judgments in US courts to turn around and sue the person that sued them in European courts in order to recover that judgment. So what's interesting though is how few Title III cases have actually been launched. It's only a couple dozen at this point. And I would have thought, in all honesty, that there would be a lot more, because as the election approaches, if Vice President Biden wins the election, he's very likely to resume the suspension of Title III, and that would close the door on any new lawsuits. So I really thought there'd be a flood of lawsuits earlier than this. And so the Title III issue, although it's been a huge diplomatic problem with the Europeans, and I should say also with Canada and Mexico, may turn out not to be the obstacle to improving US-Cuban relations that it looked like it might be originally.
Well, any answer to this question about whether by Phil or Meg about whether a re-elected Trump might rethink the US policy towards Cuba?
Well, of course, it's always difficult to imagine that Trump thinks about anything. And so I think it's giving him more credit to think that he'd not do anything because he'd want the opportunity after the election. Of course, he did in 2016. He sent Jason Greenblatt down to Cuba to take a look at the possibility of opening up a hotel there. So he had an interest, but you know, he has no way. This is such an unsystematic man, a person who acts from so little information, totally on his gut, what he watches on television. It's very difficult to imagine him thinking in long-term ways like that. And it's hard to imagine him wanting to do anything unless there was some major change that led to some crisis that would force his hand. Remember, as a result of Hurricane Michelle in 2001, President Bush, George W. Bush, who was very much against doing anything, relaxed the requirements under the 2000 trade sanctions law to make it easier to sell to Cuba as a humanitarian gesture. Trump has no humanitarian bones in his body, but there might be people around him who would consider something like that. So it's possible something could change, but I think it would take an extraordinary event.
I would agree with him. I think Trump is somebody who has not had an established pattern of consistency. So therefore, we could say that within the realm of possibilities, a decision on his part to quote unquote get a better deal than Obama got with respect to Cuba, or a increased focus on his part on his real estate holdings, might plant the seed that he should take advantage of Cuba while their economy is in a fairly weak position. But I think that's a long shot.
Well, there is some questions that reiterate there is some people that reiterate the question about what about if it is possible that the issue of Cuban medicine interferon alpha 2B appear in the electoral campaign, that if somebody would mention that, and if this can affect some special treatment in the middle of the particular juncture that we are also. There is a question by Soraya Castro, that is one of the co-editors of 2 volumes with Professor Crahan, and a very important scholar of US-Cuba relations from Cuba. And she asked, if Biden is elected, what are the US driven forces that would help Biden and push in favor of restoring the process toward normalization?
Could you repeat that? It wasn't clear, Arturo.
Yeah, we lost it. You lost you right in the middle of that.
Okay, well, it's Professor Soraya Castro. She asked, if Biden is elected, what are the US driven forces that would help Biden and push in favor of restoring the process toward normalizations?
Okay. Well, to start with the interferon, I don't think interferon is going to be an issue in the campaign. You've got to remember that the only constituency that decides its presidential vote based on Cuba policy are Cuban Americans, and maybe a few academics like us, but nobody else in the country is following the issue of Cuba or really cares about the issue of Cuba because it doesn't touch their daily life. I think it's interesting, if Cuban interferon actually shows some success, it is possible for a U.S. firm to enter a joint venture with Cuba to exploit that and bring it to the United States, but it's not going to be a campaign issue. So in terms of the question about what are the drivers that would support a Biden president wanting to improve relations with Cuba, I think the answer is the same drivers, the same constituencies that supported Obama's decision to engage, which is to say, most of the foreign policy community in the United States, which recognizes that the old policy was an utter failure, most of the business community in the United States that would like to have an opportunity to get into the Cuban market and compete effectively with their competitors from Europe and Canada and Latin America, and then the moderate wing of the Cuban American community that would like to see better relations because it enables them to maintain ties with family. I would just reiterate that half the Cuban American community supported Obama's decision and announcement to move toward a normalization of relations.
I think those are well taken points. And I would add to what Bill said by pointing to another factor that contributed to Obama's decision to move forward with, and this is the international community. And so I recall that when Obama did this, Mexico was not in the hands of, as a progressive government, as it is now. I mean, there are questions about how progressive the Lopez Obrador government is, but the Lopez Obrador had good relations with Cuba. There's changes going on in Latin America. One of the things that have helped Trump is the fact that Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia kicked out Cuban doctors. But I think that's hurt the leaders in those countries. Brazil is going through an awful lot of turmoil, and that could bring back a more progressive government that in fact would contribute to a change. And that it was Latin America that pushed Trump, that pushed Obama to make his decision to open up negotiations. And I think it could happen again.
Nick?
The issues that have appeared repeatedly in the polls of potential Hispanic and Cuban American voters are, number one, almost 50% have been the economy and unemployment. Number two has been in Florida, healthcare. And number three has been gun control. Again, this is a issue that is very strongly felt in Florida, given the repeated mass shootings that have occurred. In one poll I saw recently, only 8% of the Hispanic voters said that the US government's position on Cuba would influence their vote. So I think that the other issues I've mentioned, not only in Florida but elsewhere, particularly the issue of the recuperation of the economy and the reduction of unemployment, are going to probably weigh the most heavily.
And I think that's exactly why the Biden campaign is staying away from the Cuba issue.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we have some questions from Pedro Freire about the role of Cuban conservatives in the administration. If they have played a major, fundamental, marginal role, it will be interesting that you reflect on that. And I will add there a question about the exit of John Bolton. Mario Diaz-Balart called John Bolton, he used the superlative, the best friend that the Cuban Americans, basically meaning the pro-embargo, ever had in the US government. Does that matter? It's a different logic possible in the US-Cuba relations. And by the way, there are some people that are asking how bad this can go with a Trump administration. If you can think about a potential inclusion of Cuba, I think that you already mentioned that, inclusion of Cuba on the list of a terrorism sponsoring nation, or even a rupture of a breakdown of relationship between Cuba and the United States. There is another question that I found quite interesting by Gretchen Sanchez, and she said that there is the possibility of a speeding up of the reform process in Cuba, that a bigger expansion of the small and medium-sized private sector, and whether this could have any impact on the different factors within the United States that are interested in US-Cuba policy.
Well, so it's clear there are a number of conservative Cuban Americans in the Trump administration. The most important right now, I think, is Mauricio Claver Carone, who is the Latin American Office Director in the National Security Council. John Bolton appointed him, but he's still there, even though John Bolton has now left. And he seems to be really the architect, in concert with Senator Rubio, of the details of the administration's policy. I think the president's only real interest, frankly, in Cuba is winning re-election in 2020 by appealing to Cuban Americans. And his approach is to mobilize the conservative base, just like it is across the country with other constituencies, and to do that with emotional, hardline appeals, promising more sanctions and promising regime change. What more sanctions we might see? Well, how bad could it get? Well, the worst that it could get, frankly, is that the administration deploys the US military to interdict Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba on the grounds that that's oil stolen from the Guaido government. There's been some hinting of that in the press. That would be a very, very serious escalation. Now, with regard to the reform process in Cuba and whether that's likely to have an impact, there is right now a vigorous debate going on within Cuba over the economic reform process, whether it ought to be speeded up to get through this crisis and to help stimulate recovery from the economic crisis there, or whether it needs to slow down because the government needs to maintain central control over the allocation of resources to get through this crisis. And you can see this in the blogs and in the Cuban press. It's not going to have an impact on the U.S. election, obviously, but if Vice President Biden wins the election, I think an increase or speeding up of the reform process in Cuba would help stimulate a greater policy of engagement on the U.S. side, because advocates of going back to Obama's policy or even going beyond Obama's policy could point to the change underway in Cuba and make the argument, as President Obama did, that change in Cuba is underway, and if the United States doesn't engage, it can't have any impact on it.
You know, it is interesting that even despite the fact that there were so many conservative Cuban Americans in the administration's request for democracy promotion programs, its major subversive activity, was reduced. It asked for less money. It was the Congress, actually, that increased the amount back to up to $20 million a year. And so it's not clear that the Cuban Americans have actually had that much impact, other than, as Professor LeoGrande said, Maurice Clavel-Caron. That certainly has been an important impact, but they are situated in very key places. In USAID, the new head of the Latin American Bureau, the Western Hemispheric Affairs, is also that. So they are in important places, but I think their impact has been not as great as we might have feared.
Well, remember, the president doesn't believe in foreign aid.
Sorry.
Well, we are getting close to the end of the panel. Let me add a couple of questions that has been here. Some people are asking. Well, first of all, there is someone that asked whether this will be available. Yes, this will be available in a video in multiple places. There will be the Cuba program of Columbia University, Holy Names University will make available this video, and Nuestra America Initiative will post the video. There are some information that we have collected. Elizabeth Llorente sent us an article that showed the support for Biden nationally among the Latinos around 70%, and it was 60% for Clinton. Still, Clinton lost despite that 66% of the Latino vote went for her. Something important also I would like to mention is that in the 2018, if you compare the Latino vote in 2018 with 2014, it is the double. It was like 6 point something. In the 2014, the attendance to vote, the people that went out to vote, and in 2018 was 11.8. So if you make the calculus, it's almost double the number of Latinos that felt motivated and they came out, and it was quite important in the Democratic victory in the midterms in the House of Representatives. there are some questions here that I would like to add as to give people the opportunity to be listened and get your reactions to this one. One is whether the attack on the Cuban embassy can be used as a leverage to get Congress to move to oppose or to counter Trump's policy on Cuba. There is another question by Chris Jensen that said, what would be the medium-term effect of putting Cuba back on the state sponsor of terrorism list? And here I will, he asked, would the Biden president be able to remove Cuba from the list within the first term? Let me round this with a question of my own. Is it possible to go back to the presidential order of October 2016 on the first day of a Biden presidency?
Bill?
So the answer is yes. I mean, the president, if a new administration had a new presidential directive on Cuba ready to go, or just wanted to reinstate the Obamas, it could do that on day one. It's a presidential directive. It doesn't require any approval, although normally it would go through an interagency coordination process. On the terrorism list, the impact actually is more poisoning the atmosphere of the bilateral relationship. Most of the sanctions that fall on countries that are put on the terrorism list are actually less than the sanctions of the embargo. The one big difference is that if a country is on the terrorism list, it no longer has sovereign immunity in US courts. And so people in the United States can sue the Cuban government for personal injuries. And that's happened before when Cuba was on the terrorism list. But that's really the only substantive sanction that would accrue. And yes, a new administration could remove Cuba from the terrorism list. It would have to go through at least a brief process of assessing whether Cuba met the conditions for being removed from the list. But the Obama administration did that back in 2015, and I assume that a lot of the evidence that they collected would still be relevant. And I'll leave the congressional question for Phil.
Well, let me just say something about the terrorism list. The fact is that the claims that that Trump is using to put Cuba back on the list, perhaps, are so slim that it wouldn't take much to refute them. For example, the claim is that Cuba is harboring terrorists from the ELN in Colombia, but that's precisely so that Cuba can be involved in mediating negotiations between the Colombian government and the ELN. And so this is not something that warrants being on the terrorism list. I mean, if anything, the United States harbors as many terrorists. The congressional question was, remind me?
The question was about whether if in the first day, I think that Bill answered about that. It was about whether in the first day it will be possible to remove Cuba from, to return to the presidential directive of 2016.
He's right.
I thought there was also a congressional question in there.
Yeah, I read it, but there are
We lost it, I guess. Eh?
There are more than 70 questions here, and that I read. Beck, do you want to say something?
I think one of the issues in terms of how quickly Biden might move on any of these issues, including removing Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism, depends on how fast the new administration, if it is a Biden administration, can staff up. The State Department, Commerce, and Treasury all have a surplus of empty positions. And it's going to take some months to get essentially a sufficient staff in all of these offices to deal with priorities. And obviously, the prime priority is going to be dealing with the issue of the economic weaknesses, the current economic weaknesses in the country, as well as the dealing with reducing unemployment, etc. So in that respect, I think some of these issues relating to not just Cuba, but other foreign policy issues may very well come later on. Hopefully not too far into the Biden administration, but certainly they won't be, I think, priorities in the first 6 to 18 months.
I have a long list of excellent graduate students who are willing to take those positions.
I do too.
Yeah, and I think this point that Meg is making is a really important one, because there is an enormous list, an enormous agenda of things that a Democratic administration will want to undo that Donald Trump has done. And Cuba, in all honesty, is probably not in even the top half of that list. And so the ability to staff up these agencies and have teams of people working on this wide range of issues is going to be really critical.
Well, I remember now the question about Congress, because I put it here. It was whether Congress can do something after the impact of the attack on the Cuban embassy. If there can be something done by Congress about the security of the diplomatic mission and moving in this direction of improving the treatment of the diplomatic missions in both capitals.
Well, look, it was a horrendous attack. It was one individual. It suggests that the embassy is vulnerable, but I think that the US government acted actually responsibly. The police tracked down this person very quickly, and he's under detention. I don't think the US government favors this kind of vigilante attack against any embassy. And Congress might, in fact, beef up embassy security. That's often a popular thing, but again, it's not. It wouldn't be in response to the attack on the Cuban embassy. It would be in general diplomatic security because of terrorism threats. This, I think, is going to be seen as a one-off.
Yeah.
I think that we are getting to the end. I'm going to ask the final round, and feel free also to add your final thoughts about. There are some questions about. They said that the first memorandum of understanding between the Obama administration and Cuba was signed about the environmental issues. A question is whether even in the with the Trump administration, is it possible to move on the issue of environmental cooperation between Cuba and the United States beyond what is happening now? There is another question that talk about that there is a new archbishop in Havana, and there might be opportunities to activate contacts between the Catholic electorate of United States and the relationship with the Catholic Commission of Bishop, American Catholic Commission of Bishop. If you think that there is a role for these religious constituencies in the relationship between the two countries, or even playing a role facing either a Biden administration, he is Catholic, or in the case of Trump administration. I'm gonna leave it there. I know that we are a little over the time, so I'm gonna give the three of you the opportunity to talk. And now that Meg is in such a good shape, I could listen her so well, and we should be a gentleman and give her the first voice. I'm gonna give her the first opportunity to talk. If I'm sure that my two friends, Brenner and LeoGrande,
Okay, with respect to the possibility of the Catholic hierarchy playing a role in improving the current relations between the United States and Cuba, the current Archbishop of Havana is not as politically oriented as his predecessor, Ortega, was. On the other hand, there is within the Catholic Church in Cuba, particularly amongst the priests and to the active lay people, a strong desire for.
I don't know what happened, that again, the microphone is having trouble. So you were going very well, but we are not able to hear you now. Okay, so let's go to Professor Brenner.
So I'll speak to the issue of the environmental memorandum of understanding. What's interesting about that is that there has been virtually no contact between the two governments in order to implement that MOU. All of the contact has been with respect to NGOs. And there have been several NGOs, the Environmental Defense Fund, Ocean Doctor, very involved in environmental issues in Cuba. But government to government under the MOU, that hasn't occurred. Could Congress do something about that? It could encourage that, but we're talking about an environmental protection agency that is so delinquent in all of its activities that Cuba, again, it would be low on the list. I'll simply sum up last thought to reiterate the point that even though Congress, I don't think, will be strong in being able to initiate a change in US Cuba policy, I think it can play a very important role in supporting a president that wants to make some changes.
Bill?
So I think that the example of the environmental agreement is really emblematic of the way the Trump administration has dealt with all the bilateral agreements between Cuba and the United States that the Obama administration put in place. They have essentially stopped any kind of diplomatic dialogue about the implementation of almost all of those agreements. And it's because at the end of the day, the Trump administration is intent upon portraying the Cuban government as an illegitimate government. And that brings us back actually to the embassy shooting. I think the security response, as Phil said, was absolutely appropriate. They caught this guy immediately. But the United States government has yet to respond to the Cuban government's diplomatic note demanding a full investigation of what happened. So that is just insulting. It's just gratuitously insulting to the Cuban government. And it sends the message that the Trump administration doesn't believe that the Cuban government is legitimate enough to even deserve a response in the face of this terrorist attack against their diplomatic mission. Imagine if Cuba had responded that way when the United States protested the injuries to US diplomats in Havana 2 years ago.
Well, it has been a pleasure a great pleasure and honor to host this webinar. I think that we have discussed many important issues. There were some that still are pending, and that's what is interesting about US-Cuba relations. It is quite interesting also that a country that produced 0.12% of the global product attract so much attention that we can have a webinar with more than 300, eventually go to 324 of registered and close to 200 that came and watched the webinar directly. I look forward for new opportunities to have this conversation. I want to thank all the institutions that sponsored this debate, the Cuba program at Columbia University of the Institute of Latin American Studies. We have here Professor Crahan, who is the director, the Nuestra America Initiative, University of Miami, Holy Names University, Florida International University. And last but not least, because they are the most important actors of this conversation, the panelists and the audience that give us a great 3 great presentations despite some technical problems, and the audience that asked such interesting questions in such a big, wide spectrum of topics. So I am Arturo Lopez-Levy, Assistant Professor of International Relations at Holy Names University. It has been an honor and a pleasure to listen all of you and to channel the great questions that you asked. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Arturo.
Thank you. And thanks to the audience for tuning in.